Hello and welcome to another episode of StratcomTalks. I'm your host, Jafar Hassan. Today we are going to talk about how technology has shaped the industry of e-commerce. And to discuss it, joining me today is Adam Schwarz. He is an e-commerce entrepreneur and also a political commentator. Thank you very much, Adam, for joining us today on this podcast.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, Adam, to begin with, let's talk about the main theme of today's podcast. How do you think technology has shaped today's e-commerce industry?
Well, I think it's had an absolutely critical impact on the whole industry. I mean, we have been seeing online sales boom really, the last sort of 20, 25 years or so. But I think it's really kind of morphed and changed, particularly around the way that technologies have developed and also have been developed to allow e-commerce to basically connect with their consumers. And I think, one of the things that it's done, particularly over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, has really empowered businesses, and not just e-commerce businesses, but other sort of traditional bricks and mortar businesses, to actually engage and communicate with a much wider range of consumers than they would traditionally be able to. I think also it means that they can actually segment their markets and their target audiences in ways in which they could never do before, which obviously has huge implications for the power of marketing. But I think it also has something of a benefit for consumers as well, because it also provides access to those businesses which were traditionally only possible. That kind of interaction was only possible within in-person shopping engagement when you actually went to visit a shop, or possibly when you were calling up as well. So I think it's sort of had a dual impact for both businesses and their consumers.
Okay, Adam, I think it would be also very interesting for our audience to learn from your experience about how different is today's e-commerce industry from that of the past, let's say from early 2000s.
Well, I think it's just mainly due to the sophistication of the websites themselves. If you look at examples of how they looked, let's say, as you mentioned, the early 2000s, they were very, very basic businesses, very basic interfaces that were quite manually intensive for both the developer of the website, the business owner, but also of the consumer as well. I think what technology has done is it's basically allowed businesses at a very low cost and sort of low manual labor cost to create those kind of interfaces, which has really meant that you can have very good looking and very highly interactive websites that consumers can engage with. But I think also what you've seen over the last maybe 7 or 8 years has been sort of a democratization or diversification as well of the e-commerce space, because it's not just let's say the e-commerce platforms that have been created. It's also the fact that they've opened up those platforms to a huge amount of app developers that have allowed a lot of technology companies to actually come in and to create specific widgets and specific tools for those businesses to use. And that really ranges from a whole huge range of different type of activities that they want to use. For example, you get shipping integration apps, or you also get marketing integration apps, or simply visual integration apps. So I think that really in itself has created a huge amount of competition, which has made really an amazing space for innovation in the field. So I think, as I say, overall, it's meant that businesses and websites have become much more sophisticated, which ultimately has led to a better experience for the consumer.
Right. So certainly technology has played a pivotal role in reshaping or perhaps reinforcing today's e-commerce industry. But Adam, I'm sure this did not happen without any challenges. So what kind of challenges do you think are faced within today's e-commerce industry?
Well, of course, the biggest challenge really that we've seen most recently has been the pandemic. And I think it's certainly presented challenges to all industries. But, I think e-commerce is slightly different in the sense that actually so many businesses have actually looked to e-commerce to be the solution for so many of the problems that the pandemics have that the pandemic has created. But I think actually, even though, some people were looking at e-commerce businesses and saying, oh, well, you're in such a good position to be in a pandemic because of your infrastructure, there are actually some challenges presented by the pandemic. And I think, logistical challenges are challenges that e-commerce businesses have faced really not just in the pandemic, even though it's got worse in the pandemic, but actually throughout the whole sort of period of growth in e-commerce. And I think one of the things that's really driven that has been the increasing expectation on the side of consumers for very, very good delivery experiences. I think this is something that's been set by some of the much larger players in e-commerce, particularly Amazon, which in some countries like the UK provides, one-day delivery service times, which has meant that actually much smaller businesses as well also have to be providing the same level of services, because actually that's what consumers have come to expect. So I think making sure that you have a really robust supply chain system and delivery system to make sure that you can fulfill the expectations of consumers is absolutely vital. I think another challenge that we're seeing become a much bigger issue has been the issue of regulatory oversight. Obviously, generally over the last 20 years, e-commerce businesses have grown in quite a free regulatory environment, which has really allowed them to use a whole range of different marketing tools, really quite minimal supervision. But I think, as we see more attention focused on, let's say, Facebook and some of the bigger marketing platforms, we're actually seeing more scrutiny being applied to exactly how businesses and companies engage with consumers. And the main impact I would say that has on e-commerce businesses at the moment has been the fact that you've sort of had a more difficult time in businesses targeting consumers because of increasing regulation around the way that businesses are allowed to collect data, but also target consumers using that data. So I think that's a particularly, pertinent point that so many e-commerce businesses around the world have had to own up to. But I think, those are really the main two challenges. But I think also, I'd add a third one to that, and that is, changes in the way that consumers actually behave. When I first joined the e-commerce space around 2016, 2017, I was told by an industry leader that all I simply had to do was provide a very sort of authentic advert on Facebook to basically demonstrate my product. And if you did that, you could expect very, very good results. Certainly true for a while, but I think we've seen consumers demand a lot more from businesses, mainly due to an increase in competition.
Indeed. Now, Adam, I want to pick up on one of the points you mentioned about the pandemic. Now, certainly, the pandemic has resulted in some sort of challenges for the e-commerce industry. But don't you think at the same time the pandemic has helped in reinforcing the e-commerce industry? Because certainly there was a boom in e-commerce because a lot of businesses went online during the pandemic.
I completely agree. I think to some extent it acted as a sort of catalyst for changes that were already taking place. But I think, basically it's made, non-e-commerce businesses realize that they need to diversify in terms of trying to create resilience for these kinds of major economic and social shocks to the system. I think that's meant even more investment has been put into supply chains that ultimately is going to benefit, e-commerce businesses in the future. But I think also, because of that, you're also going to see increased competition for e-commerce businesses, which I think overall is a good thing because ultimately it drives innovation.
Indeed. Now, Adam, we spoke about how technology has shaped today's e-commerce. We spoke about some of the challenges being faced in this industry. Now, tell me, how do you overcome these challenges, since you have worked as a policy advisor and you still are, I believe, an e-commerce entrepreneur. So tell me, how do you overcome these challenges?
Well, I think ultimately, one of the things that's been so useful is actually using some of these apps and the technologies that have come out to try to engage in ways with consumers that they see, to be sort of conducive to that kind of relationship. And I think ultimately, you can't just survive as an e-commerce business by, only communicating with consumers through explicit marketing, telling them repeatedly you need to buy this product. What you actually need to do is establish a sort of authenticity and a connection with your consumers, beyond that kind of very simple traditional marketing. And I think, one of the things that we've certainly been using is automated emailing, which has allowed us to develop that relationship with our consumers on issues that really matter to them. So, for example, I run a pet product business, and we know that our consumers and our customers, care deeply about the welfare of their pets. So, we've been sending emails to them during periods of lockdown to tell them actually how to increase the welfare of their pets during that time. So that's certainly, a way in which we've been able to engage with our consumers. But we've also in the last few years shifted from self-fulfillment, so sending out the products ourselves, to getting a third-party logistics company to do that. And it can be a very, very difficult thing to do because the complexity and, of the supply chains involved in trying to send so many different deliveries across a very wide geographical range. But actually, technology really, really helps with that, because actually you can very easily get integration apps that basically translate across all your different selling platforms and then plug into the delivery mechanism that you need. Using those kind of tools, which are very, very easily accessible, is really a way to try to overcome some of these challenges.
Okay, now what I'm about to ask you now might not be entirely related to the topic of discussion, but I believe it is something that everyone is talking about these days. Do you think metaverse could be integrated into e-commerce?
I think it absolutely could, to be honest. I think that's probably part of the attention of Mark Zuckerberg and the rest of the Meta, previously known as Facebook, board. I mean, I think ultimately, the way that Facebook has developed over the last 15 years or so is that it starts in a very social way. It's intended to provide connections simply between people as a social tool. But ultimately, what that does is provide a very, very useful framework for the business to actually use that data that it collects to create a sort of marketplace for firms ultimately to kind of take advantage of that and to provide consumers with consumer choice. And I'd be very, very surprised if Meta didn't look at this current project as ultimately a stepping stone towards that. But I think they're being quite careful in the way that they're approaching it. So I think they know that they've had quite a bad press in the last few years just because of the concerns over the way that they use data. So I think at the moment they're just focusing on the infrastructure, and then they'll probably move to commercializing it.
Okay. Now, Adam, before I let you go, I'm sure many of our listeners are people who want to enter the industry of e-commerce. So what would be your advice to them as someone who has been in this industry for over 3 years?
So, firstly, I would say there's a huge amount of material out there about the way to start e-commerce businesses. There's a lot of people who will be selling consulting services, but actually there are people who have done, and started e-commerce businesses, thousands and thousands of times. And you really want to draw on their experiences. So I would say use some of those free materials out there that will take you through some of the steps, which ensure some of those, easy mistakes don't happen. But what I would say is start off simple in the beginning. I think it's very easy when you're starting a business to have huge plans and huge expectations, and I think that's okay. But you really want to start off just by testing the model and the concept first. And it's quite easy to do that using some of the existing e-commerce platforms to create a business around. So, for example, Shopify or Wix have very easy to create business platforms, which you can start off doing. And I would say just focus on whatever you're doing it of extremely high quality, and always thinking about what the end consumer ultimately sees. Because I think, obviously, as a business person, how much effort and work has gone into creating everything that you do. But ultimately, you're there for the consumer, and the consumer only has a few basic contact points with the business. And the first is the initial advert that they see. The next is the landing page, and then ultimately, hopefully, is the purchase. And I think you want to make all of those as enticing as possible. But ultimately, in order to get success, you have to be collecting data, in obviously an ethical way. But you also have to be constantly testing and optimizing. There's not a single successful e-commerce business in the world that is not continually testing new types of marketing. Because ultimately, consumers demand interesting things, and they don't just want to see the same types of content repeated in front of them. So keep on testing, ensure that whatever you put in front of them is of high quality, make sure that your supply chains are very good standard and very efficient.
All right, Adam Schwarz, thank you very much for sharing your insights into this topic. I really appreciate your analysis.
Thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate it.